about the president. Just pray for him. Because God is using that man outside your understanding. You can only understand Donald Trump if you read the Old Testament and see how God used prophets to destroy. So guess what? On one side, Donald Trump is doing God's will, while at the same time, he's also producing the very vengeance that's going to cause people to attack us in the future. But it's ordained that way. Okay? They are dancing so much in Nigeria because Donald Trump went over there for one reason and brought it with the United States military. He said, oh, you want to kill Christians? Wonderful. We're going to kill you. And we sent a bunch of military people over there and they just start knocking down terrorists like you do at the bowling alley. He said, this is return for what you're doing to Christians. About the president.
President Trump's remarks on Cuba today.
Increíble. Creo que Cuba no tiene esperanza. Cuando ya lo habíamos perdido por 67 años. Venga de un presidente como él. O que alguien te dé una esperanza de que tú seas libre, de que tú puedas expresarte sin miedo. Es una luz entre tanta oscuridad que tenemos en el corazón, en nuestros pensamientos, que nos fueron presos por muchos años. Y muchos de nosotros, como primera generación, aquellos que se escaparon o los obligaron a escaparse, que nunca vieron la posibilidad de ver Cuba libre, yo me imagino hoy día oír esa noticia de él sería vivir un sueño que alguien te está dando y que espero se realice, porque la gente ha tenido que escapar, mucha gente ha muerto tratando de llegar aquí a los Estados Unidos o a otro país y muchos años no pudimos dormir ni levantarnos con un desayuno porque nuestras manos sabían que cocinar en cuenta de un gobierno, un régimen cruel como el de Venezuela.
Elaine, Fidel Castro killed my grandfather's father, my grandfather's brother, tried to kill my grandfather. That type of life, imprisoning people, it's not a way to live. Thank God to Trump and Trump's policies.
We're here in South Florida where members of the Cuban diaspora tell us that they're filled with hope. Hope that for the first time in 67 years, their country might be saved from communism, and a hope that's being fueled by President Trump's most recent remarks.
Many of you have come today and they say, I hope you can take care of Cuba. I'll take care of it, okay?
That was President Trump over the weekend, giving the strongest indication yet that he may be planning on toppling the Cuban regime.
I appreciate you guys for watching this video. We got to talk about what's happening right now in Cuba, because this is one of those moments that people are going to try to spin. They're going to try to ignore, and they definitely not going to connect the dots for you. But we are. As things continue to unfold over there, you're starting to see exactly what happens when a country is run into the ground by a failed system and then cut off from the very resources that keep a modern society alive. Now, a lot of Cuban Americans, especially those who supported Trump, you guys already understand this dynamic better than most. You've seen this movie before, you lived it, your families have lived it, and that's why you see such strong alignment from people like Marco Rubio and others who actually understand the reality on the ground. They are in lockstep support with how this administration is handling Cuba right now, and that's not by accident. It's because they know exactly what kind of regime we are dealing with. And let's be honest, none of this should come as a surprise, because if you've been paying attention to global politics, you knew this was coming. Once pressure started mounting on Venezuela, once things began escalating with Iran, it was only a matter of time before the Cuba regime started to feel the squeeze. These regimes don't exist in isolation. They rely on each other. They prop each other up. And when one starts to fall, the others get exposed. And that's exactly what we're watching happen in real time. Now, here's where it gets serious right now. The people in Cuba are dealing with a nationwide blackout. Think about that for a second. Not a rolling blackout, not your power might go out for a couple hours. We're talking about entire regions losing power because they simply do not have access to oil. Their infrastructure cannot function without it. Their grid cannot sustain itself without it. And this is where I need people, especially on the left, to really sit down and think. Because for the last several years, we've been lectured nonstop about how we need to move away from oil, how fossil fuels are evil, how we could just flip a switch and transition into some green utopia where everything magically works. And we were told this over and over and over again. Policies were pushed, agendas was forced, people were shamed for even questioning it. And now, right in front of your eyes, you have a real world example of what happens when a country does not have reliable access to energy, especially oil. Within weeks, not years, not decades, weeks, you're looking at a full scale collapse of basic infrastructure. No power, no stability, no normal life. And now suddenly the same people who were cheering for these policies are losing their minds watching this unfold. They are shocked, they're outraged, but this is exactly what many of us has been warning about and the entire time we've been warning about this. Energy independence is not optional. Oil is not just some outdated relic we can toss aside because it sounds good politically. It is the backbone of modern civilization, and Cuba right now is proving that in the most brutal way possible. So before we go any further, I need you to understand what you're looking at here. This is not just another international story. This is a preview. This is a warning. I mean, a real warning. And if you don't think it can happen elsewhere, under the wrong leadership and the wrong policies, you're not paying attention. Hit the like button and share the video, subscribe to the channel, and check this out.
When you say Cuba is next,
Cuba.
is Cuba, whatever you do with the military there, it seems like something, will that look more like Iran or Venezuela?
Can't tell you that. I can tell you that they're talking to us. It's a failed nation. They have no money, they have no oil, they have no nothing. They have nice land. They have nice landscape, you know. It's a beautiful island. I think they have great people. You know, I know so many people from Cuba that were treated terribly, and they're over here, they became rich. They're very entrepreneurial people, very smart. I know a lot from Florida, especially. There's so many people. A friend of mine started over with nothing. He's now the largest owner of gas stations in the country and stuff. I mean, Cuban. I also know, I was just with a fantastic person who's Cuban and made a fortune in sugar, you know, Fanjul family, right? And this family wants to go back to Cuba to visit it. They haven't been back in like 50 years or something. They largely come from Cuba. And we'll see what happens. They were asking me about that. They want to go back, not only Fanjul, a lot of Cubans have said, oh boy, would they love to go back. I think Cuba, I don't know, is in its own way, for tourism and everything else, it's a beautiful island, great weather. They're not in a hurricane zone, which is nice for a change, you know. They won't be asking us for money for hurricanes every week. But I think Cuba's the end. You know, all my life I've been hearing about the United States and Cuba. When will the United States do it? I do believe I'll be having the honor of taking Cuba. That'd be good. That's a big honor.
Taking Cuba.
Taking Cuba in some form, yeah. Taking Cuba. I mean, whether I free it, take it, I think I could do anything I want with it. You want to know the truth? They're a very weakened nation right now. They were for a long time. Very violent leaders. Castro was a very violent leader. His brother's a very violent leader. Extremely violent. That's how they governed. They governed with violence. But a lot of people would like to go back.
And this is where things start to get really interesting, because you can almost hear the reaction the moment someone even hints at the idea of taking Cuba or fundamentally changing what's going on over there. People's heads start exploding, especially on the left, because they immediately jump to the most extreme interpretations instead of actually dealing with the reality in front of them. But let's just slow this down for a second and talk about what Cuba actually is versus what it could be. I've never personally been there, but you don't have to step foot in Cuba to understand the basics. It's a beautiful country. The land is rich. The location is incredible. The people, by all accounts, are hardworking, resilient, and resourceful. There is no reason, and I mean absolutely no reason, that Cuba, should be another failed nation, and it is a nation. But in today, other than one thing, it's government, right? The evil dictatorship, and that's why it's a failed nation in itself. And this is yet another example added to the list of a communist socialist regime that has completely failed its people. And I need people to really sit with that. How many examples do we need? How many countries have collapsed? How many populations have to suffer? How many blackouts, shortages, and humanitarian crises have to happen before we stop pretending like this ideology works, because it doesn't. It has never worked. And every time it's tried, it ends the exact same way, with people paying the price while those in power live comfortably and maintain control through force. That's the reality. Now, look, it's unfortunate what the Cuban people are going through right now. Nobody is celebrating the fact that they're dealing with a nationwide blackout. They don't have reliable access to basic necessities, and that their daily lives are being turned upside down. But here's the uncomfortable truth that a lot of people don't want to say out loud. Sometimes things have to get so bad that change becomes unavoidable. And sometimes the system has to completely break before people are willing to say enough is enough. We are doing something different. That's not cruelty, that's history. That's how major shifts happen. And when you start talking about what that something different could look like, that's when people really start losing their minds. Me personally, I'm going to be clear. I'm not sitting here saying Cuba should become the 51st state. I don't think that's the move. That opens up a whole different set of political and constitutional questions that I don't think makes sense. But could Cuba become a US territory? Could it follow a path similar to Puerto Rico, Guam, or the U.S. Virgin Islands? Now, that's a conversation worth having, because if you actually look at Cuba objectively, not emotionally, it is prime real estate. Its geographic location alone makes it incredibly viable. You're talking about tourism, potential resorts, development, trade routes. There is so much untapped opportunity just sitting right there. Golf courses, hotels, infrastructure, energy development. You could transform that country to something completely different within a relatively short period of time under the right leadership and system. But instead, what do we have? Over 60 years, 6 decades of mismanagement, oppression, and economic failure under a regime that has consistently put ideology over its people. The Cuban people have been mistreated, restricted, and held back for generations. And that's not up for debate. That's documented reality. And what's frustrating is that when you start talking about actual solutions, when you start talking about rebuilding, restructuring, and bringing in systems that have a proven track record of success, there's always a certain group that pushes back, not because they have better ideas, but because they're ideologically attached to a system that has failed over and over again. Liberals, especially the ones who still romanticize socialism, cannot stand when you point out these realities. They don't like when you talk about progress in a way that contradicts their worldview, because real progress requires accountability. Real progress requires admitting that something doesn't work and being willing to change it. And that's exactly what we're seeing play out with Cuba right now. A country with every opportunity to succeed, completely back by a failed system, now reaching a breaking point where something has to give.
Humanitarian crisis happening in Cuba. There is a humanitarian crisis happening in Cuba as we speak. There's no fuel. There's no electricity. There's no trash pickup. Trash is piling up on the streets, meaning disease could start to spread at any moment. The hospitals are not running at their capacity. They don't have staff that is showing up due to the working conditions, and some just can't get there because there's no fuel. There's a blockade happening by our government. And the Cubans for Trump, I have to ask, are y'all cool? Are y'all okay with what's happening? Because as I recall, just a couple of weeks ago, y'all were at Mar-a-Lago partying it up, enjoying yourselves, having a ball while this was happening. It's not funny, because famine will begin to happen real soon. No water in a lot of places already. Are y'all cool? It's sad what's going on. And
I can't hear no more. They cool. And this is the part that people that conveniently ignore whenever they try to downplay what's happening in Cuba or pretend like it's just another country going through economic challenges. No, this has been a full-blown humanitarian crisis for decades. Decades. And if you want proof, you don't have to look at some reporters, some think tank analysis. You just have to look at the behavior of the people who live there. People do not risk their lives for no reason. People do not throw themselves into the ocean, build makeshift rafts out of scraps, or swim miles across dangerous waters just for the experience. That doesn't happen in a functioning, healthy society. That happens when people are desperate. That happens when the conditions are so bad that staying feels more dangerous than leaving. Think about that. You had Cubans They're literally risking limb and life just to make it to the United States. Swimming, floating on whatever they can put together. Entire families taking chances that most people wouldn't even consider, all for a shot at freedom and opportunity. And it's not just isolated stories, it's a pattern. It's been happening for generations. You even have stories, and this one sounds almost unbelievable, but it's real, of individuals so determined to escape that they stole airplanes. One man took a plane, flew it low to avoid detection, made it all the way to the United States, contacted air traffic control mid situation, but he said, "Hey, I'm here." By the time they tried to tell him he couldn't land, he already landed. That's the level of desperation we're talking about. And what makes that story even more powerful is that he later went back, knowing the risk, knowing what could happen to him, to get his children. That's not just desperation, that's conviction. That's someone saying, I refuse to let my family live under this system. So when people try to act confused about why Cuba is in the condition it's in today, or they try to minimize it, or worse, defend the ideology that created it, it doesn't line up with reality. The reality is written in the actions of the Cuban people themselves. They've been voting with their feet for years, trying to get out by any means necessary. And that is the clearest indicator you can possibly have that something is fundamentally broken. And now with everything that has happened, the blackouts, the shortages, the instability, you are seeing that long-standing crisis reach another level. It's not new. It's just more visible now. And this is why I want you to hear directly from people who have actually lived through it. People will understand it on a level that no politician or commentator ever could. Because when you hear from someone who has experienced that system firsthand, like this 88-year-old grandmother who is actually excited about what's happening right now, it puts everything into perspective. It cuts through the noise, the spin, and the political talking points. It reminds you that at the center of all of this are real people who have been dealing with the consequences of a failed system for far too long.
Mom, can you explain to everyone in English and in Spanish why Americans, specifically liberal Americans, people that are liberal, son liberal, or whatever, however you call it, liberales, and not really the Democrats, but mostly liberal Americans, why they're so opposed to the U.S. going to Venezuela and taking out Maduro when all of Venezuela is happy, and why they're saying Cuba. Mind you, my grandma's Cuban, 100% Cuban. My grandparents are from Cuba. So then they're saying, Cuba, watch out. They're coming for you next. The U.S. needs to mind their own business, calling Trump a communist. How do you feel about all this? Venezuela and then Cuba.
Están diciéndole que Cuba está en problemas y queremos que Trump saque eso de ahí. El problema de Cuba con el comunismo. 90 miles from the United States.
So in English, say it in English.
No, 90 miles from the United States.
No, but it basically, you're saying that Cubans, right? You guys want this. You want this. You want Trump to go to Cuba and get rid of the communists.
Yeah.
Have you ever wanted to go back or no because of what's going on in your country?
With the time, but at this age, what I'm going to do over there now? You know what I mean? I'm living in this country for 70 years already.
And what happened when you left? How bad was it when you left?
It was bad. Not as bad as later, you know what I mean? But I did in Cuba 3 years or the 4 to be a teacher. I did 3 years or the 4. Then the 4 came the communists, and then they closed all their schools.
They closed all the schools, and what else did they take from you guys?
Yeah.
People that had big houses and farms, what happened?
My mother had a house from one street to the other one. They took it.
They just took it?
Yeah.
Gave you nothing? And where did she live after that? Homeless? Had to live in a...
She came here.
Right away?
Yeah.
You guys had to flee. And how did they take the house? Was it the military? They came in and just kicked you out? Or they... No, but like, was it by physical force? I'm trying to picture this.
I don't know because I was here already.
You already left. You fled. Okay. And how do you feel about Trump going to Venezuela and getting rid of Maduro? And to all the American liberals that don't understand.
No, he did right. He did right. Communists que se queden en el comunismo. Aquí en los Estados Unidos no puede haber comunistas.
Yeah.
No.
And another thing is that a lot of Americans are also saying that they just want to go to Cuba because we're an ideal location. The island is in a perfect location for military base, and he just went to Venezuela for the oil. So what? As long as the people are liberated, take what you want. Who cares? It's better than the people being oppressed and murdered, right?
Cuba was good with the Americans over there.
Yeah.
It's not that they control 100%, but I mean, you know.
And Cuba was fine with having Americans there, weren't they?
Yeah.
Yeah. Just like Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico's a part of the United States, right?
Puerto Rico, yeah.
Okay. Thank you for your opinion. I appreciate it. All right, love you.
And this is where the conversation really starts to separate people who are thinking practically from people who are just reacting emotionally. Because the moment you start talking about any kind of U.S. presence or involvement in Cuba, you immediately hear the same talking point over and over again. Oh, they just want to build military bases over there. Like that's supposed to be some kind of automatic negative. Like that's the end of the discussion. But let's actually think about that for a second instead of just repeating slogans. Let's say there are bases built in Cuba, naval, army, maybe even Marine Corps installations. Do you understand what that actually means on the ground level for the Cuban people? That's jobs, that's infrastructure, that's stability, that's economic activity that they have not seen in decades. You're talking about construction projects just to get those bases up and running. Housing has to be built, roads have to be improved, utilities have to be stabilized. You are immediately injecting investment into a place that has been starved of it for generations. And then what happens after that? You bring in service members, you bring in personnel, you bring in families, and now you need businesses to support all of that. Restaurants, stores, maintenance services, logistics, transportation, healthcare support, entire local economies start to grow around that presence. This is not theory. We've seen this happen in multiple places around the world. U.S. bases don't just sit there in isolation. They create economic ecosystems around them. So when people try to frame that as purely negative, they're either ignoring reality or they just don't want to admit that it could actually improve conditions for everyday Cubans. Because compare that to what they have right now. Right now, you're dealing with a government that can take your property, restrict your freedoms, control your access to resources, and leave you sitting in the dark during a nationwide blackout with no real options, and you don't truly own anything. You don't control your future, and you're dependent on the system has consistently failed you. So the idea that introducing structured development, investment, and yes, even a military presence could create opportunity is not some wild concept, it's common sense. And let's not ignore another obvious piece here: tourism and private sector growth. Cuba is sitting at what is essentially untapped gold when it comes to tourism, the beaches, the climate, the culture. This is prime territory for resorts, for travel, for international businesses. The moment you open that up under a system that actually allows for economic growth, you're going to see an explosion of opportunity. Hotels, golf courses, entertainment, transportation, jobs across the board. People who have been stuck for decades suddenly have pathways to build something for themselves. And that's what real progress looks like. That's what happens when you move away from a system that suppresses growth and into one that encourages it. But again, every time you bring this up, there's a certain group that just cannot stand it. They'll twist it, they'll criticize it, they'll just try to make it like some exploitation instead of opportunity. And honestly, it's exhausting at this point. Because what's the alternative? Keep things exactly the way they are? Keep supporting or excusing a system that has clearly failed? That's not compassion, that's negligence. That's ignoring reality because it doesn't fit your ideology. And that's why this moment matters so much, because Cuba is at a crossroads. Things are already bad and they're getting worse, which means change is coming one way or another. The only real question is whether that change is going to move them toward freedom, opportunity, and growth, or keep them stuck in the same cycle that has been holding them back for over 60 years.
Can you imagine what's happening in Miami right now? Those Miami Cubans are losing their everlasting mind because they're like, yay, Donald Trump said he's going to take us. And they thought it was a good idea. They were like, that's a great idea. He can take us because we're going to trade one dictatorship for another. He doesn't see what's happening right now. Donald Trump doesn't want you in this country. He wants you to go back to your island. And I don't know what to tell you. You're looking for status like Puerto Rico. Right now, they're working behind the scenes to make Puerto Rico an independent country. You don't seem to understand that. The problem is logistics for them because they make so much money, billions of dollars because of the Jones Act. Meanwhile, while all of this is happening and people are starving, they don't have enough oil to keep the lights on, and they're not able to provide for their family. And forget about housing, because it's no bueno. But you guys are jumping up for joy. You know what he's going to do? A big old golf course right there in Cuba. And there's going to be some serious colonization going on if anything was to happen. You guys are ridiculous.
And this is the part that really drives me crazy because people will sit here and complain, they'll criticize, they'll throw around words like dictatorship and oppression when they're talking about the United States, all while having the freedom to go online and say whatever they want with zero consequences like this woman you just seen. Think about how backwards that is. You're literally exercising your freedom of speech to claim that you don't have freedom. Trying, try doing that in Cuba. Try hopping online in Cuba and openly criticizing the government, calling out leadership, organizing dissent, and see how that works out for you. And it's not going to end with a debate. I can promise you that. Same thing in China, same thing in Venezuela, the old Venezuela, we should say. And these are actual examples of governments that restrict speech, that control information, that punish people for stepping out of line. And that's what a real lack of freedom looks like. But here in the United States, people have become so detached from reality. They have become so spoiled that they throw these terms around like they don't mean anything. And it's not just inaccurate, it's disrespectful to the people who are actually living under those conditions right now. While we're sitting here having open conversations, debates, and disagreements, there are people in Cuba who can't even speak freely about what's happening in their own country without fear of retaliation. That's the difference. And when you tie that back into everything we've been talking about, the economic situation, the blackouts, the lack of opportunity, it just reinforces the bigger point. Anything that moves Cuba in the direction of more freedom, more economic opportunity, more stability is an upgrade from what they're dealing with right now, period. And when you're starting from a place where the government controls nearly every aspect of your life and fails to provide even basic necessities, almost any structured development is a step forward. Bringing in jobs, building infrastructure, creating opportunities, those are not negatives, those are lifelines. And yet you still have people who will sit back and criticize that, who would try to frame it as something sinister instead of acknowledging the obvious reality that is better than what they have right now. It's frustrating, man, because at some point you have to be honest about what works and what doesn't. And what Cuba has been doing for the last 60 plus years clearly doesn't work. But instead of learning from that, instead of recognizing the pattern, there are still people out here defending the very ideas that led to the situation in the first place. It just doesn't make sense. It's disconnected from reality, and it just shows how far some people are willing to go to protect an ideology, even when the evidence against it is right in front of their face.
Dictator, and I think Trump did the right thing. He's just taking out dictators.
Yeah, 2 for 2, aren't we?
Yes, 100%. I'm waiting on Cuba next. I'm Cuban, so I'm hopeful.
Okay, tell us a little bit about why. So you're Cuban.
Yes.
Why would you support, I guess, Trump taking military action in Cuba?
Because they've been a dictatorship for years and years now. Basically, my entire family fled Cuba to the United States because of safety, financial, everything. Like, my mom and my grandma moved here to give me everything that I have now, and Cuba's a beautiful country. It's beautiful, but it's destroyed right now. There's no food, no nothing. It's deserted. It's horrible.
As an American, I want to defend my country and represent my country. And if you're openly saying death to America, that's something that I'm personally not going to stand for.
Okay. All right. Appreciate it. Hope you guys.
And this is why the perspective of Cuban Americans matters so much in this conversation, because these are people who don't have to guess what communism looks like. They lived it. Their families have lived it. They experienced the consequences firsthand. So when they hear certain ideas being pushed here in the United States, when they hear language that sounds even remotely similar to what they know that system represents, it immediately sets off alarms. It's not theoretical for them. It's not some abstract classroom discussion. It's real. It's personal. And that's exactly why you see so many Cuban Americans lean conservative, why you saw such strong support for Trump within that community, and why there is such a strong emphasis on capitalism, individual rights, and economic freedom, because they understand in a very real way what the alternative look like. They've seen what happens when government control expands to the point where it dictates nearly every aspect of your life. They've seen what happens when private property rights disappear, when opportunity dries up, when speaking out comes with consequences. So when they compare that to what exists here in the United States, even with all our flaws, they recognize the difference immediately. But then you have another group, primarily on the left, and especially among those who like to present themselves as highly educated, who have been sold a completely different version of that story. They've been fed this polished, idealized version of socialism and Marxism that sounds good on paper. When it comes to Marxism, I can't get the word out, but you get my gist, right? Marxism, but completely ignores how it exactly plays out in real time. It's like a theory that never has to face reality in their minds. And that's the problem, because when you remove the real world outcomes from the conversation, you can make any system sound appealing. You can package it, you can rebrand it, you could dress it up. You could dress it up in language about fairness and equality. But at the end of the day, the results don't lie. And the results every single time look a lot like what we're seeing in Cuba right now. Shortages, lack of freedom, economic stagnation, people trying to escape by any means necessary. That's not an accident. That's the pattern. And it's frustrating to watch people ignore that pattern, especially where there are entire communities of people right here in this country who could tell you exactly how it ends because they lived through it. It's not a fairy tale. It's not some misunderstood system that just hasn't been implemented correctly. Okay. And it's been tried over and over again, and it keeps producing the same outcome. And it pisses me off, and that's why I'm so passionate and stuttering like this, because and yet somehow there are still people willing to defend it, still willing to promote it, and still people unwilling to listen to those who have actually experienced it. And that disconnect, that gap between theory and reality is a big part of why conversations like this even have to happen in the first place.
Please keep your mouth shut about what is currently going on in Cuba. The narrative that you guys are creating about the U.S. embargo being the reason Cubans are suffering is absolutely disrespectful.
She's saying, and I respect that, okay, unless you live in Cuba. Yeah, I don't. So I wouldn't know. But what I do know is that you voted for Trump. And guess who they're blaming right now for what's happening in Cuba? Now, no, it is not quick little research tells me, no, it's not just the U.S. that is causing this. They have had a corrupt government, and, you know, they've always kind of dealt with that in Cuba. But it does say that the current crisis is connected to an intensifying standoff with the U.S. So the government has recently tightened sanctions and blocked or pressured countries that used to send to Cuba, which is the oil. They don't have any fuel right now. These sanctions include threats on tariffs on nations that ship fuel to Cuba. Who is doing that? Who do you think is doing that? So no, I'm not very well versed in this. And no, I don't live in Cuba, but I know that you don't like that people are telling you that you voted for Trump and you're getting this because of your vote. And it is to your homeland. They are suffering because of your vote, and you don't want to hear it. We aren't making things up. We are seeing it. We're researching it. We're seeing it happen. Yes, they can both exist. There was a corrupt government, and now because of your vote, he is causing a lot of this right now.
This is ignorance. Why? She never asked. She just pointed out a bullet point and a talking point, but she never asked why the oil was cut off and why Donald Trump went after making sure that he cut off the oil supplies to these evil dictator regimes. Because this was the oil that's been cut off that we now control, using as leverage to obviously get these regimes and to get it together to free the individuals like Venezuela. It goes all the way back to Maduro, right, in Venezuela, right? Their infrastructure was destroyed, basically, because when you look at it, the famine and things that were taking place, that's how Maduro stayed in control over there in Venezuela. And if anybody disagreed with him, he would basically off them. Right? That's dictatorship, evil dictatorship, demonic. So the simple fact is the oil was the thing that they were using as leverage, and how they spread to those who agree with them. They would be able to live and be able to survive and have their basic necessities. But those who spoke out against these regimes, they basically suffered and possibly even died, right? Due to retaliation. So the whole point is, if oil is enriching these evil dictator regimes, don't you think we should cut off that supply so they can enrich themselves? And then if they can't enrich themselves, then how powerful are they going to be as a regime before we swoop in and obviously free the people that's in that country in the first place? So this is another part of a conversation that people don't like to have, but it needs to be said in a way that's actually grounded in reality instead of just emotion. There is a level of arrogance that comes from certain political circles where they genuinely believe they understand these systems, like this woman on the screen right here, who just talked off of a bullet point from ChatGPT, but never really did no research, right? Because they genuinely believe they understand these systems better than the people who have actually lived under them. Think about how crazy that is for a second. You will have someone who grew up in Cuba or Venezuela or any of these countries that have experienced socialism and communism firsthand, telling you detail how bad it is. And then she just said she's not very versed in this. So why speak to it, right? She wants to talk about the shortages and government control and lack of freedom, right? And fear of speaking out, like she knows what she's talking about, but she's not even versed into this, and she can't speak too much to it, but she's speaking to it, right? And then you have, like you said, like I just said, right? Like she just said she's not versed in this, but then you have someone here like her in the United States who has never experienced any of that, like the Cuban and Venezuelan people that I just explained that have experienced this socialism in these systems, will sit there and say, no, it's not really like that. or that's not real socialism. Based on what? Based on theory? Based on something you read in the classroom or saw it online? That disconnect is the problem, family. It's not about attacking people personally. It's about calling out that mindset. When you dismiss firsthand experiences from people who have actually lived through these systems, you're not being compassionate or informed. You're being willfully ignorant, and you're choosing ideology over reality. And that's dangerous because it allows bad ideas to keep circulating while being without being challenged by real world evidence. And there's also this tendency to constantly try to reinterpret or downplay these situations instead of just accepting what they are, instead of listening, instead of saying, okay, maybe there's something here we need to learn from. The response is to argue, deflect, or reframe it into something more comfortable. But the truth doesn't change just because it's inconvenient. The people from these countries are telling you exactly what the system produces. And instead of respecting that, too many people brush it off like it doesn't matter. And that's why these conversations get so frustrating, because at a certain point, it's like, are we actually trying to understand what's going on, or are we just trying to protect a belief system no matter what the evidence says? Because if it's the second one, then we are not having an honest conversation anymore. And if you are not willing to listen to the people who have lived it, then what are we even doing at this point? Right? You're not interested in truth. You're just interested in being right. But anyway, family, check this out.
Venezuela, and they would take in a lot of money from Venezuela. Now they don't have that. They won't be taking in any money. So, Marco, what do you think?
Well, I mean, the fundamental problem in Cuba is that it's run by incompetent people that don't know what an economy looks like, much less a functioning one. They've made a choice, and that is they would rather have political control over the people than they would have an economy that functions. And they've gotten away with it for 60-something years because they've had donors, the Soviet Union, and now most recently Venezuela. But that's now gone. So the people in control in Cuba have a choice to make. They can either have a real country with a real economy where their people can prosper, or they can continue with their failing dictatorship that's going to lead to systemic and societal collapse. So it's a very stark and dramatic choice, and it's one we hope to make the right one. We don't have an interest in a destabilized Cuba, but that would be their fault because they refuse to allow the people of Cuba to have either economic or political freedom for that matter.
And you have Venezuela.
Secretary Rubio, do you support, and I know this is up to Congress, but do you support easing the trade embargo if you get more cooperation from Havana?
Well, I'm not going to discuss what we would talk about or not. Suffice it to say that the embargo is tied to political change on the island. The embargo is codified. And but the bottom line is their economy doesn't work. It's a non-functional economy. It's an economy that has survived. That revolution, it's not even a revolution, that thing they have, has survived on subsidies from the Soviet Union and now from Venezuela. They don't get subsidies anymore, so they're in a lot of trouble. And the people in charge, they don't know how to fix it. So they have to get new people in charge. That's what has to happen.
And the relationship we have with Venezuela.
And I finally want to leave you with this, because this is where everything comes full circle. Shout out to Marco Rubio. Seriously, call it how you want, agree or disagree on certain things. But when it comes to foreign policy, especially in this situation, he has shown that he understands exactly what's going on. Big Mark, man. He ain't little Marco no more. And that matters. A lot of you have already been saying it. You know, you've been in the comments, you've been having a conversation. Some of you looking at 2028 and saying, hey, Marco Rubio might be that guy. Others have mentioned JD Vance, and that's a conversation too. JD Vance is phenomenal as well. And when you're talking about the international stage, when you're talking about dealing with situations like Cuba, Venezuela, Iran, these aren't small issues. Rubio has consistently come across as knowledgeable, as steady, and yes, as presidential. Now, let's just keep it real. He understands the history, he understands the players, and more importantly, he understands the stakes. Because what's happening in Cuba right now didn't just pop up overnight. This has been building for years. Cuba has been surviving off of subsidies, off outside support, off of other nations propping them up, like Venezuela, right? Propping them up and giving them monies in the form of oil and all of that stuff, right? But now look at the situation. Venezuela is collapsing. Russia is stepping back. You have to realize that China and all of our adversaries were basically buying oil. Venezuela was actually in Cuba. They were actually using oil as their money makers. But if you don't have your money maker no more, then how can you be a strong regime? So Russia is stepping back and basically saying you're on your own, right? When it comes to Venezuela collapsing and all of that. And all of a sudden the safety net is gone. That changes everything, because now the Cuban regime doesn't have the same options it used to have. They don't have the same backup. And when that happens, reality sets in real quick. Now you're in a position where you have to come to the table with the United States. You don't really get to play the same games anymore. It becomes a situation of either you adapt or you collapse. And that's where we are. Meanwhile, the people in Cuba, they're fed up. They're frustrated. They've been dealing with this for generations. And now with the blackouts, the shortages, everything stacking on top of each other. And you're starting to see that breaking point. And Cuban Americans here in the United States, a lot of them are looking at this moment like it's something they never thought they would see in their lifetime. A real possibility that things could actually change. And that this system that's been in place for over 60 years might finally be forced to give way to something different. And that's powerful. And here's the thing that really ties it all together. While the media, while the left, while all the usual voices continue to criticize, complain, and try to tear down anything associated with strong leadership, people around the world are watching results. They're not listening to talking points. They're watching what actually happens. And when action is taken, when pressure is applied, when real changes starts to unfold, people notice that. They respond to that. So at the end of the day, I'm going to trust the people who have lived this. I'm going to trust the Cuban Americans who have been sounding alarms for decades. And I'm going to trust what we clearly can see clearly happening right now instead of what people are trying to spin it into. And I want to hear from you. What do you think this leads to? Where do you think this situation in Cuba goes from here? Drop your thoughts in the comments, like the video, share the video, and subscribe to the channel. Turn on your post notifications so you never miss another upload. On that note, family, peace.